The silent withdrawal. Commander Helena Morse stood in the center of the Galactic Unity Assembly Chamber, her hands clasped behind her back as she waited for the noise to die down. The massive circular room stretched upward for nearly 100 meters, with observation decks spiraling along the walls where representatives from 300 different species watched the proceedings. The air smelled of ozone and the strange mix of atmospheres that the environmental systems worked constantly to balance. Helena had been Earth's primary representative to the Council for 8 years, and in all that time she had never seen the chamber so chaotic. Admiral Vexcor of the Draknari Empire slammed his scaled fist against his podium, causing the metal to ring out across the chamber. His species stood nearly 3 meters tall, with dark red scales that caught the light from the chamber's artificial suns. "This is an outrage!" he roared, his translator converting his hissing speech into standard galactic. "Humanity demands equal representation on the Resource Allocation Committee. You have been members of this council for barely a century. My people have guided galactic civilization for 10,000 years." Helena remained silent, watching as other representatives joined the outcry. The Zelthari Corporation's spokesperson, a being of crystalline structure that pulsed with different colors as it spoke, chimed in agreement. "Human economic contributions are minimal, at best. Your species controls less than 2% of galactic trade. This request is not only premature, but absurd." The Vixian Collective's Hive representative, speaking through a chorus of smaller voices, added its criticism. "Humanity's technological development is centuries behind the baseline standard. Your scientists still struggle with concepts that our youth master in their first learning cycles. How can you expect equal standing with superior civilizations?" Helena had heard it all before. Every request Earth had made in the past decade had been met with the same dismissals, the same condescension, the same assumption that humanity was too young, too primitive, too insignificant to matter. When human colony ships had discovered and mapped 37 new habitable worlds in the outer reaches, the Council had thanked them politely and then granted colonization rights to older, more established species. When human engineers had solved the power distribution problem that had plagued Station Nexus for 2 centuries, the credit had gone to a Zelthari consulting firm that had done nothing but file the paperwork. When human medical researchers had developed the treatment for the Crimson Fever that had killed millions across a dozen worlds, the patents had been seized under emergency health protocols, and humanity had received nothing but a formal acknowledgement. The jeering continued for another 10 minutes. Helena left them have their moment. She had delivered Earth's message, and that was all that mattered. When the noise finally began to subside, she spoke again, her voice calm and clear. "The United Terran Republic formally withdraws from the Galactic Unity Assembly, effective immediately. All human personnel, facilities, and assets will be removed from Council space within 90 days. This decision is final and not subject to negotiation." The chamber fell silent for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the laughter began. Admiral Vexcor laughed so hard that his translator struggled to keep up with the sounds. "Good riddance," he finally managed to say. "Perhaps now the real powers of the galaxy can conduct business without interruption from primitive species who cannot accept their proper place." The Zelthari representative pulsed with colors indicating amusement. "Human economic contributions are minimal, at best. Your species controls less than 2% of galactic trade. This request is not only premature, but absurd." Only a few voices remained silent. Ambassador Thalara of the Lumari, a feline species known for their analytical minds, watched Helena with concern in her large golden eyes. The ancient keeper Archon, who rarely spoke but observed everything, leaned forward in his floating meditation chamber, his expression unreadable. But these quiet voices were drowned out by the celebration of those who believed they had just rid themselves of an annoying inconvenience. Helena gathered her data tablets and walked toward the exit. Her assistant, Marcus Webb, fell into step beside her as they left the chamber. "That went exactly as expected," Marcus said quietly, as they entered the private transport corridor. "Yes," Helena replied, "they still don't understand what's coming." Across the galaxy, the evacuation had already begun. Dr. James Park sat in the central command center of the Human Data Management Facility on New Terra, watching screens that displayed information from every human installation in Council space. The facility had been built 20 years ago, ostensibly to help coordinate human contributions to the galactic knowledge network. In reality, it was the hub of something far more complex. Status report. James said to his team of 300 technicians who worked at stations throughout the vast underground complex. All primary protocols are active, his deputy director Sarah Chen reported. We've begun the systematic removal of human contributions from galactic databases. The process is being executed across 14,000 separate systems simultaneously. James nodded, watching as progress indicators flowed across the main display. Humanity had been very careful over the past century. Every piece of information they had shared with the galactic community, every technological advancement, every scientific discovery, every engineering solution had been carefully tracked and documented. More importantly, humans had quietly embedded themselves into the maintenance and operation of systems throughout Council space. They had volunteered for the difficult jobs, the dangerous assignments, the tedious maintenance work that other species considered beneath their dignity. And now, all of that work was being undone. "How are the colonies responding?" James asked. "Operation Exodus is proceeding on schedule. New Vancouver reported complete evacuation 6 hours ago. Kepler Station shut down its reactors and departed the system 3 hours ago. We're expecting another 47 installations to go dark within the next 12 hours. The evacuation had been planned for years, prepared for in secret by a network of human leaders who understood that Earth's position in the galactic community was untenable. They had tried cooperation, tried integration, tried to prove themselves worthy of respect. But every achievement had been dismissed or appropriated. Every request had been denied. Every attempt at equality had been met with mockery. And so, they had prepared for this day, building new colonies in uncharted worlds, developing technologies in secret, creating infrastructure that owed nothing to the Council or its member species. On the mining station designated as Extraction Point Gamma, human workers completed their final shift in the asteroid belt that had provided rare elements to half a dozen major industrial worlds. Station Chief Robert Martinez watched as the last transport ship was loaded with equipment and personnel. The station's automated systems would continue to function for approximately 72 hours after the humans departed, and then they would shut down completely. The mining platforms, the processing facilities, the transportation network that moved materials to the refineries, all of it would cease to operate. "Sir, we're receiving complaints from the Zelthari Corporation. They're demanding to know why we're evacuating. They say we're under contract for another 6 months. Tell them to read Section 47 of the contract, the clause that allows for immediate termination in the event of political circumstances beyond our control, and then shut down all external communications." The officer nodded and sent the message. Robert had worked in this asteroid belt for 15 years, along with 800 other humans who operated the mining platforms. The Zelthari Corporation had purchased the mineral rights to this region, but they had never bothered to learn how to actually extract the materials. That work was left to humans, who were paid a fraction of what other species earned for similar labor. The corporation had made billions, and humanity had been grateful for the scraps. No more. In the medical research facility on Station Meridian, Dr. Yuki Tanaka supervised the deletion of research data that represented 20 years of work. The facility had been humanity's primary contribution to galactic medicine, developing treatments for diseases that affected multiple species. But the Council had never granted humans any share in the patents or profits from these treatments. They had been classified as gifts to galactic civilization, with the understanding that such generosity would earn humanity goodwill and respect. That understanding had been wrong. All patient records have been transferred to secure storage. The active research projects are being packaged for transport. We should be ready to evacuate within 18 hours. Yuki nodded and looked around the laboratory that had been her home for so long. She thought about the crimson fever treatment they had developed, the neural regeneration therapy that had saved thousands of lives, the anti-aging process that had extended lifespans across multiple species. All of it would continue to exist, but the knowledge of how to replicate or improve these treatments was leaving with humanity. The Council would eventually figure out how to reproduce some of it, but that would take years, perhaps decades, and some of the more complex treatments might never be duplicated. Back on Earth, in the underground command center beneath the mountains of Colorado, Director General Sarah Morrison watched the evacuation progress with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had been one of the primary architects of this plan, working with a secret council of human leaders to prepare for the day when humanity would need to leave the galactic community. It had seemed almost paranoid when they first began the preparations 15 years ago. Now it seemed like the only rational response to a situation that had become untenable. "How many installations remain?" she asked her operations coordinator. 73 active facilities, plus another 216 unmanned stations and platforms. All should be cleared within the 90-day window we specified. Sarah pulled up a holographic display showing the location of every human presence in council space. Blue dots represented active facilities, green dots showed installations that had already been evacuated, and red dots indicated locations where complications had arisen. There were remarkably few red dots. Humanity had become very good at planning and executing. The cascading collapse. The first major system failure occurred on day 37 of humanity's evacuation. The primary power distribution network for the industrial sector of Nexus Prime, the galaxy's third-largest manufacturing hub, experienced a catastrophic cascade failure that shut down production across 240 facilities. Engineers from the Zelthari Corporation rushed to diagnose the problem, only to discover that the automated maintenance protocols that had kept the system running for decades were no longer functioning. The backup systems, which should have activated immediately, remained dark and silent. Chief Engineer Vaxtol stared at the diagnostic screens in growing panic. The readouts made no sense according to standard engineering principles. The power grid should have been self-regulating, with multiple redundancies built into every critical junction. But somehow, all of those redundancies had failed simultaneously. "This is impossible," he said to his team of technicians. "These systems were designed to handle any conceivable failure scenario." His senior technician, a Vixian drone specialist, examined the control interfaces carefully. "Sir, there are modifications throughout the entire network, custom programming that isn't in any of our documentation. It looks like someone has been manually adjusting the power flow parameters for years, compensating for stress factors that our original designs never accounted for." Vaxtol pulled up the maintenance logs, searching for records of these modifications. What he found made his crystalline structure pulse with alarm. Nearly every significant adjustment to the system over the past 20 years had been performed by human technicians. They had identified problems that the original Zelthari designers had missed, implemented solutions that went beyond standard protocols, and kept the entire network running smoothly through constant small corrections that no one else had noticed or understood. "Contact the human maintenance crew," Vaxtol ordered. "We need them back here immediately." "Sir, the humans evacuated this facility 19 days ago. They're no longer in council space." The power grid on Nexus Prime remained offline for 6 days before Zelthari engineers managed to implement a temporary solution. Production resumed at 40% capacity, with constant supervision required to prevent further failures. The economic cost of the shutdown was calculated at 17 billion credits, and that was just the beginning. Similar failures began cascading across council space with increasing frequency. Transportation corridors that had been safely navigated for centuries suddenly became hazardous. Ships reported gravitational anomalies in areas where none should exist, radiation spikes that damaged sensitive equipment, and navigation errors that sent vessels dangerously off course. The GTA initially blamed the problems on equipment malfunctions or pilot error, but the pattern was too widespread to ignore. Captain Thexalon of the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream had been navigating the Kepler corridor for 30 years without incident. The route was considered one of the safest in the galaxy, a stable pathway through space that connected major trade hubs. But on day 42 of humanity's evacuation, his ship's navigation computer began throwing error messages that he had never seen before. "The stellar drift calculations are wrong," his navigator reported, her voice tight with stress. "The computer says we're on course, but the sensor readings don't match the star positions we should be seeing." Thexalon checked the navigation database, which contained detailed charts of every known trade route. The Kepler corridor data showed standard coordinates that had been in use for a century. But when he compared those coordinates to his ship's real-time sensor data, there was a discrepancy of nearly 3 degrees. In the vast distances of space, that small difference could send a ship thousands of kilometers off course. "Who maintains the navigational charts for this corridor?" he asked.
His navigator pulled up the administrative records. Primary survey work was completed by the Dreknari Empire 70 years ago, but the update logs show that human survey vessels have been filing regular drift corrections for the past 40 years. The last update was filed 60 days ago. 60 days ago, right before humanity began its evacuation. Thexelon ordered an emergency course correction and limped into the nearest station at reduced speed. When he filed his report with the Transit Authority, he discovered that 43 other ships had experienced similar problems in the Kepler quarter in just the past week. 6 vessels had suffered serious damage, and 2 had disappeared completely. The Transit Authority issued an emergency bulletin suspending traffic through 17 major trade routes, pending complete navigational surveys. The cost of rerouting galactic commerce was staggering, and the delays rippled through supply chains across hundreds of worlds. Shortages began appearing in markets that had never experienced such problems. Prices for basic goods started to rise as transportation became more expensive and uncertain. Admiral Vexkar stood in his command center, watching as reports flooded in from Dreknari military installations throughout the Empire. His mood had shifted from triumph to fury over the past 3 weeks. 12 of his warships had suffered critical system failures. 3 deep space monitoring stations had gone offline without explanation. And his engineers were discovering the same pattern everywhere they looked. Systems that should have been self-sufficient had actually been dependent on constant human maintenance and adjustment. "How did this happen?" he roared at his chief of military engineering. "How do we become dependent on a primitive species without even knowing it?" The engineer, a veteran of 40 decades of military service, looked exhausted. "Sir, the humans volunteered for assignments that other species found undesirable. They worked in hostile environments, performed routine maintenance that was considered beneath the dignity of more advanced species, and solved problems that fell outside standard protocols. Over time, they became integrated into critical systems without anyone realizing how essential they had become." Vexkar pulled up a holographic display showing the locations of human activity throughout the Empire over the past century. The map was covered in thousands of blue dots, each one representing a facility, station, or installation where humans had worked. And every one of those dots was now a potential failure point. "Find them," Vexkar ordered. "Send scouts into the space they evacuated. Track their ships. I want humanity located and brought back to repair what they broke." The scout ships departed within hours, heading toward the regions where human colonies had existed. What they found shocked even the experienced military crews. The planets that had supported millions of humans showed no signs of recent habitation. Buildings were gone, leaving only bare rock or native vegetation. Orbital stations had vanished completely, with no debris fields to indicate they ever existed. The humans hadn't just evacuated, they had erased every trace of their presence. More disturbing were the sensor readings the scouts detected at the edges of former human space. Massive energy signatures appeared on long-range scanners, suggesting industrial activity on a scale that shouldn't have been possible. Strange gravitational distortions indicated the presence of objects too large to be conventional space stations, but whenever the scout ships tried to investigate more closely, their systems began to malfunction. Navigation computers failed, weapons systems went offline, and communication arrays stopped working. The scouts were forced to retreat, unable to approach close enough to identify what humanity was building in the darkness beyond Council space. The agricultural crisis emerged more slowly, but with devastating consequences. Worlds that had produced abundant food crops for generations suddenly found their yields dropping. Soil that had been fertile became sterile. Plant diseases that had been controlled for decades returned with aggressive force that overwhelmed standard treatments. Dr. Hulvar, the Council's chief agricultural scientist, assembled an emergency task force to investigate the crisis. He reported to the Agricultural Committee, "The problem is widespread. 47 major food-producing worlds are experiencing crop failures. Another 93 are showing early warning signs of similar problems." The committee members, representing species from across the galaxy, demanded explanations. How could such failures happen simultaneously across so many worlds? The agricultural techniques being used were well established and proven over centuries of use. Dr. Hulvar had spent weeks trying to answer that question, and the results of his investigation were deeply troubling. He said, "The agricultural methods we've been using were developed or significantly improved by human scientists over the past 70 years. They shared their research freely, helping other species increase crop yields and disease resistance. But when we tried to access the detailed technical documentation for these methods, we discovered that the files have been deleted from our databases." One committee member, a representative from the Botanical Worlds Alliance, protested loudly, "That's impossible! Our agricultural archives have multiple redundant backups across dozens of systems. No single point of failure could erase that much data." No single point of failure, Dr. Halvar agreed. But the humans worked as data technicians and system administrators throughout the Galactic Knowledge Network. They had access to all of those backup systems, and they appear to have systematically removed their contributions before they departed. The implications silenced the committee. Without the technical knowledge that humans had provided, the galaxy would have to redevelop centuries of agricultural science from scratch. In the meantime, billions of beings faced potential food shortages. The medical crisis followed a similar pattern. Hospitals and clinics across council space discovered that treatments that had worked flawlessly for years were suddenly ineffective. Dr. Mara Saxton, chief of medicine at the Central Galactic Hospital, watched in horror as patients who should have been easily cured instead grew worse. The neural regeneration therapy that had restored function to millions of patients with spinal injuries no longer worked. The Crimson Fever treatment, which had virtually eliminated the disease, was failing. Anti-aging therapies that had extended lifespans across multiple species were breaking down at the cellular level. "We don't understand the underlying mechanisms," Dr. Saxton admitted to her medical board. "The treatments were developed by human researchers, but they shared only the application protocols, not the fundamental science. We followed their procedures without fully understanding the theory behind them." The medical database, which should have contained complete research documentation, showed massive gaps where human contributions had been. The files were simply gone, deleted with such thoroughness that even forensic data recovery specialists couldn't retrieve them. The galaxy's most advanced medical facilities were reduced to treating diseases with methods that were decades out of date. Ambassador Thexalara sat in the council chamber, surrounded by representatives who finally seemed to understand the magnitude of the disaster they faced. It was day 71 of humanity's 90-day evacuation period, and the evidence of galactic dependence on human contributions was overwhelming. She had compiled reports from dozens of sectors, creating a comprehensive analysis that painted a picture of cascading system failures